So the title of the talk this evening is "The World is Alive." I wanted to start off just with sharing some experiences from earlier in my life where I had a strong sense of the world being alive. And I'm going to present different arguments that the world is alive and isn't, and you'll guess from how I'm starting that I actually think the world is alive. So I'm giving that away to start with. So I've talked in previous talks about when I used to work in Newcastle. I used to work in advertising for Northern Rock. I've not told the job after that. I had a job for a short time after that where I worked in an advertising agency as an ad exec, and basically that's when I had a spell of a year. I had a strong sense of the world being very alive, and it started in quite a strange way. Or maybe not just the world is alive, but kind of like life isn't quite as it seems all the time. So it started off with some strange experiences in the office where I'll be on the phone to clients, and a regular thing started to happen was whenever I tried to end the phone conversation, I ended up saying exactly the same thing as the person on the other end of the phone. It's really weird. So it started to happen really regularly. I'd just say exactly the same words at exactly the same time as the other person. It was almost like a kind of a clairvoyance is how I experienced it. It's like I just said exactly the same thing as they did, exactly the same time all the time. So it freaked me out, so I tried to vary what I said and kind of pause. And it just kind of continued to happen. I'd pause and then say something different and it'd be exactly the same as what they said. And it just really unsettled me, actually. It freaked me out a bit. But I suppose I didn't pay masses of attention to it, but I think it did kind of start to, I think it was the universe starting to open up my spiritual life, actually. I think Sangha writes about this in his memoirs. I've been reading his memoirs again recently, and as a teenager he worked at a council in London briefly, and he describes a series of experiences where he had visions which were preempting what was about to happen in like half an hour's time or an hour's time. He had a series of 7 or 8 visions in his office where he just saw what was going to happen in an hour's time or half an hour's time. So I think these kind of things, might happen sometimes to people, but it can happen sometimes at the beginning of people's spiritual lives. And then what happened was I gave up the job, and the job started to be, I started to have a sense that there was more to life, and this job wasn't what I was after. So I didn't know what to do. I went travelling. Basically, a friend suggested to go travelling, take a gap year and go travelling. And basically, I want to share some anecdotes from that period where I just had a strong sense of the world being even more alive, continuing to be alive. And some photographs from this gap year as well, just to kind of, for light entertainment. I initially went to Australia and New Zealand, and nothing too weird happened there. It was just straightforward kind of gap year stuff. And then, but then I had a spell where I left the friend I was travelling with and went on my own. And I was kind of scared, but I was excited as well. It felt like the start of my adventure. And I hadn't really prepared for it. I was going to Tahiti, and I didn't know what the language they spoke was in Tahiti. I didn't have any currency. I didn't have anywhere booked to stay. But I just had this kind of intuitive sense that it didn't matter, that it was going to be okay, that the world would look after me, that somehow that if I trusted, I don't know where this came from, I just had this intuition that if I trusted the universe, and kind of everything would just work out. It was kind of naive, but it kind of preempted a very, very strong experience. It lasted for about a couple of weeks where it just seemed like the universe was alive and looking after me. It's difficult to describe, but it was a very, very strong experience. I won't go into some of the details, but it was just a very, very strong experience that if I needed something, it seemed to just arise against the odds, or people turned up against the odds. And I just had this very vivid sense for a couple of weeks that I was in quite a strong relationship with the universe. It was alive, and it was looking after me. It was benevolent. And it seemed to last for 2 weeks, and then it seemed to kind of fade again. But during that time, I was in Tahiti, and I'm the one at the bottom. And one of the things that happened was I didn't have anywhere to stay, and everywhere was really expensive. And out of the blue, this Tahitian family took me in, and the guy I was travelling with, and really looked after us. It was really humbling, actually, the generosity. But they just looked after us. They we'd never met them before, but they said, come to our house. They put some mattresses on the floor, we slept, because they could obviously tell we'd been out clubbing and needed a rest. Cooked a really nice meal for us, then offered to take us out clubbing in the evening, pick us up in the morning on the way to church. Basically just really, it's almost like they just appeared and looked after us for a few days, and then we moved on again, and another magical experience seemed to happen. So it lasted for a couple of weeks. And then I went to Tahiti, from Tahiti to Easter Island, and met some interesting characters there. This was a birdman on Easter Island, part of the kind of tradition of Easter Island. But I met some other interesting characters, which are these, what are called the Maui. I think they're called Maui or Moai. They're the huge stone heads that no one really understands why they're there. No one really knows why they're there. And they're kind of littered across this island, which is completely remote, the most remote island on the planet, and they've got these sacred, sacred sites really, these huge carved stone heads. So we were at the quarry where they were made. Well, no one really knows when and why. And one of the things that happened there was there just seemed to be a real energy about this place. This all happened in a couple of weeks. So the week after Tahiti, I was in Easter Island, and there just seemed to be this really strong, powerful energy. Felt very much, particularly around these statues, these heads, that there was a real energy that the place was alive. And it seemed to have an effect on me where I seemed to have answers for everything. I don't know where they came from, but I was chatting to this friend. I'd met this Australian guy into the early hours of the morning about the life and the universe and the meaning of life, and I just seemed to know the answers for some reason. I just seemed to kind of really clearly have an intuitive sense of what everything was all about. It just seemed to be something connected to this particular place. There seemed to be real energy about it. I don't know if any of this is coming across. It's very alive for me. So the particular 2 weeks, that was really, really vivid, and the world just seemed very, very alive. And then things kind of settled down again. I went from there to Chile, then I spent quite a few weeks and months on the beaches of Brazil. So this is a few, I'm put a bit more weight on. I've now got a beard and quite a bit more relaxed than I was when I started. But this is in Peru, and I then went on a trek to Machu Picchu in Peru towards the end of my gap year. And there was another strong sense of the world seeming alive, actually, kind of sacred and alive. So I went on this kind of 4 or 5 day trek through the Andes. You can see the kind of path winding through the mountains, and it was, I think partly the dramatic landscape of the mountains and the sense of the kind of power and awe of the mountains really humbled me and felt very sacred, and the whole kind of landscape felt very alive. We had a guide and porters, and you could tell they felt very much part of the landscape, and the guide would play a flute that would kind of help the porters to climb up. It just kind of felt like quite a magical space, and it became quite a pilgrimage actually. I hadn't set out to be a pilgrimage, but we walked on these kind of ancient stone pathways towards Machu Picchu. And then, there's these kind of, in the middle of these snow-capped mountains. It was really dramatic and had a sense of, the kind of awe and wonder of the world, the mystery of it, and I get a sense of it being alive. And then when we arrived at Machu Picchu, there were just parts of it where I just stood there, and again, I just felt this very powerful energy of the place. I felt charged with energy, and there's just something very special, very magical about this place, very sacred about this place. So I wanted to just share, to begin with, some experiences of mine of when the world has felt alive and magical and mysterious. And another reason for starting with that gap year is that when I was away, what I noticed is that different cultures see the world very differently. In different cultures there are stories, there are views, attitudes towards the world. So I started to get a sense of, in a way, the arbitrariness of some of our stories and assumptions in the West, some of the ways that we approach life. You step out and you get a real perspective of that there's just other ways to live, other ways to see life. So I'll just close with this picture and leave with this picture on for the rest of the talk. I just found it on Google, and it for me captures something of the feeling of the world being alive. So the theme we're looking at is shocking Buddhist ideas, or radical Buddhism, radical Buddhist ideas. And each week we're taking an idea, Buddhist ideas, that really challenges a view in the West, a story or a view in the West. So this week's talk is The World is Alive. And the particular view that I want to challenge is a philosophical view that and in a way underpins a lot of Western thought and education and the way we perceive and look at the world, and to a sense, perhaps our approach to Buddhism. And it's a view called materialism, philosophical materialism. So after I volunteered to give this talk, or only actually in the last few days, I realised that I needed to talk quite a bit about philosophy, and I've never really studied philosophy, so so I'm going to give you a philosophy lesson. But bear in mind, I'm not an expert, and this is a very entry-level philosophy lesson. So there's this very very powerful view in our society, philosophical materialism. So what is it? Basically, the definition of materialism, it's not to be confused with being materialistic, which we often talk about, which is where we just want to consume and acquire and get lots of possessions. That's being materialistic. Materialism is maybe something that underpins that, but it's something different from that. So the definition of materialism is that everything you experience is matter. It's only matter. It's material. It's matter. Either that or it depends on matter for its existence. And so I'll say that again. Basically, everything we experience is matter. It's material. It's kind of solid matter material. There's nothing else. There's nothing that isn't material in our universe, in our experience. And there's also an extension of that which can be called physicalism, which is basically that everything is governed by physical laws. Everything we experience is governed by physical laws. And the assumption is, well, basically we can find out, we can discover what these laws are, and we can discover everything about the universe. Everything is knowable and discoverable and controllable because it's all physical, it's all matter. And maths can sort it out, in a way, maths can sort it out. So anything non-material which can't be measured just doesn't exist. It's kind of ridiculed or nonsense under this philosophy. And it began in the 19th century, apparently. I've got a friend, Advaita, who's got a real strong mind, and he told me a bit about the background of it. And I also picked Vedanya's brains as well, because he's got a very strong philosophical mind. I haven't, so you can tell. But apparently it began in the 19th century, and it was a reaction to theism in Christianity. So Christianity was very powerful, and it kind of swept away paganism. And I suppose when paganism went away, also went the idea that the world was alive, and what was replaced was with theism, Christianity, that God had created the universe, and he was a lawmaker. There were the laws from God, and you couldn't disobey them. And then, in the 18th century, there's a man called Newton, you've probably heard of, and he discovered some very important physical laws about the universe. He discovered that you could measure and predict and, in a way, start to control the universe, but through these very reliable and successful laws. So he discovered some very important physical laws. And on the success of that, people started to say, well, actually, there's not a God controlling the universe. There's laws like gravity and other physical laws. We've started to be able to predict and measure the universe, in a way, things that would happen. So on the back of that, people really rejected Christianity. Christianity was rejected. And people started to believe that there was no God. All that was real was matter. Matter was the only thing that was real. But in a way, what had happened is that they'd gone a step too far. They'd kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater, because as well as throwing out God, they'd thrown out any other possibility of anything other than matter, which was quite a big assumption to make and quite a mistake, actually. So it was based on some quite dodgy thinking, but the idea was that everything is matter. So there's no God, all there is matter. And it left people with quite a restrictive choice, which we still have, most people still have today. It's either God or nothing. It's either a God or a kind of dead universe, which is just made of matter. And so most people today just go for that second choice. It's a kind of meaningless, dead universe made of matter. So that's how it started. And basically you might think, well, why is Bodhinaga telling me this? What's this got to do with me? And the reason is that it's basically a view that's deeply entrenched in our society. And probably for a lot of us in our minds, without realising it, a lot of the way we approach life, Buddhism even, will be will be influenced by this view. And I'll explore some of the ways it might be influenced by that. And it can limit our progress in the Dharma life. So yeah, it's based on some flawed, materialism is based on some flawed assumptions, some flawed ideas. And it's also based on some outdated science, actually. It's based on 18th century science, and science has moved on quite a lot since then, but actually the thinking in our current society hasn't really caught up with that. It's still based on outdated science. So to give you just an example, there was someone you've probably heard of is Einstein. So there's probably the two scientists I'm including, you've probably all heard of Newton and Einstein. And there's a quote from Einstein which gives a very different take on the universe, actually, to the take of materialism. Yeah, so Einstein said, one of the things he said was, "The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and all science. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead. His eyes are closed. Two things are infinite, the universe and human stupidity." And I'm not sure about the universe. So Einstein's approach wasn't that everything can be known and everything can be understood and maths could sort everything. It was more that there was a mystery, and that was very sacred. The mysteriousness was very sacred. And he even described himself as religious on that basis, that he believed in a mystery behind things that couldn't be known. And with kind of quantum physics, what was discovered was matter was a bit weird, actually. Matter isn't as predictable. It turns out it's quite weird. And it turns out that consciousness, which has been dismissed by the materialists, was really important. If somebody is observing matter, it affects how matter behaves. So I'm not going into the details because I don't really fully understand them. But what the quantum theorists discovered was that matter is quite weird and unpredictable, and not exactly as Newton thought it was. But it's based on some outdated science. But it's also the idea that there's an idea in materialism that our consciousness depends on the brain. Basically, it's the brain, because everything is physical. Your mind is your brain, so you don't have a kind of consciousness separate from that, or mind separate from that, which seems crazy to me now. Actually, I think I've been a Buddhist for too long because in some ways because it just seems really crazy, the idea that your mind is your brain or your consciousness is your brain. But that's kind of quite a prevalent idea. And so there's this idea that somehow matter gives rise to consciousness, and it's never been able to be explained. Materialists have apparently never been able to explain how this happens. They just say, well, it does. Matter gives rise to awareness, to consciousness. So, it's almost like the story of Pinocchio. If you remember the story of Pinocchio and the carpenter, is it Geppetto or Geppetti? He makes this doll, and then all of a sudden this doll becomes aware and has consciousness. And that's how materialists try to explain our consciousness, that there's matter. And then suddenly out of this matter arises this completely different phenomenon of awareness and consciousness somehow comes out of matter. And they've never been able to explain exactly how that happens. But they say that, well, we will do because it's material. There must be a law for it, so we'll discover it. But they've never been able to make that jump, really. It's quite a big jump, because consciousness is very, very different to matter. Anyway, this is a bit abstract, so I'm going to move on. But basically, materialism is based on flawed assumptions in science. That's worth just saying now, because what I'm going to do next is explore some of the implications it has on our life, on your lives, and on our approaches to Buddhism. And we can remember that it's actually dodgy. It's dodgy thinking, dodgy logic. So everything is matter under this view of the world, that everything is matter, and everything follows mathematical laws. It started in the 19th century, but it's kind of spread into all different aspects of modern life. So modern economics is based on this kind of thinking, the idea that everything can be calculated by models, everything kind of fits neatly and it all works out. And people have made calculations, they found calculations that prove that a free market economy will be fair for everybody, it will produce a fair outcome for everybody. And you can see from experience that's nonsense, it doesn't work like that. But people have got these, economists have got these flawed assumptions based on materialism that everything is knowable, everything is provable. So it affects economics. It affects psychology. So psychologists and psychology is based on materialism. And there's this idea that our mind is the brain. And through studying the brain, we can learn and we understand how consciousness and the mind works. So people think that our thoughts are neurons and electrons and ions and things like this, kind of flows of neurons in the brain, are actually what our thoughts are, and that we can record thoughts and measure the thoughts. So it affects how people view psychology, and in a way it affects how people view mindfulness in the current age, because people think that mindfulness is about kind of redirecting pathways in your brain, and actually mindfulness isn't really about that. That might be involved in part of that might involve redirecting your brain, but so it affects. It's quite wide-reaching effects. And I think one quite important one is that if everything is matter, then in a way it's not that important. The world around us, if it's a dead machine, it's just matter. It's not sacred. It's not important. It's not to be cared for in a way. It's for us to exploit. It's for us to use. So we get an attitude that the world becomes a commodity. The world becomes basically something to use. So we can cut down forests, we can mine minerals out of the earth, we can drill in the Arctic, because basically the world is a commodity. It's matter. There's nothing kind of higher or valuable about it. It's just kind of a dead machine. So we lose a kind of a sacredness. Traditional societies throughout the world have always had a sacred relationship with the world and with the universe, and unfortunately that's been lost. So we've got this sense of this relationship with the world that it's for us to use and for us to exploit. Even human beings become commodities, because human beings are just matter. We're made of matter. We become commodities. Bodhinaga came and gave a talk a few months ago now, where he talked about how generosity is even seen as being a commodity. That generosity is a resource. We can use up generosity. We've got some really strange ideas about life, actually, but they have quite important effects on our society. So materialism, is prevalent, and it has a real effect on how people think about the world. But it also has implications for us as Buddhists, how we might approach Buddhist life. You could argue that if our mind, if our consciousness is just our brain, it's like a kind of supercomputer. Well, what does that make enlightenment in a way? Is enlightenment just getting a kind of a faster processor, a kind of souped-up computer? Is that what enlightenment is? It just gives a kind of very limited perspective on what enlightenment might be. If everything is matter and there's nothing higher than matter, well then it's very hard to see how there are any values or any real meaning or values in life. It can lead to what we call quite a nihilistic approach to life, where, in a sense, what's life about? If there's no God and there's nothing else, well, what's life about really? I might as well just have as much fun as I can and be, get as distracted as I can, party as much as I can, consume as much as I can, and then I'll die basically, because if there's nothing else, or when I die, the lights will go out, there's no kind of consciousness, it's just all matter, it's all material. So it affects how people live their lives, and it means that there's no intrinsic kind of universal morals. If there's any kind of higher values, then they're values that we just decide arbitrarily. So there can be no kind of beauty, there can be no intrinsic ethical values, because why would there be? It's just everything is just matter. Okay. So other ways that our practice of Buddhism might be affected by materialism. So we've got these figures called Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in Buddhism. You might have seen them. We've got statues of them, images of them. We do rituals to them. So if you've got any kind of materialistic influences, which I'm sure we all have, then there'll be a bit of you that says, well, what a load of nonsense, actually. That kind of, well, how can that be real? How can kind of figures who haven't got physical bodies, kind of be real. How can they be real? What can be the value in that? What can be the purpose of that? What a load of nonsense, actually. And I'll be honest, there's a voice, I can sometimes have a cynical voice that will say that. And that's the influence of materialism. Everything is matter. There's nothing outside of matter. Well, then how on earth could there be Buddhas or Bodhisattvas? And or something like performing a ritual to Buddhas or Bodhisattvas would just be ridiculous, actually. It would just seem quite a ridiculous thing to do. And I'm sure for some of us, some of the time, even a lot of the time, it might seem a ridiculous thing to do. So it's kind of worth questioning, well, where do these assumptions, where do these kind of attitudes towards what is real and what is not real, where do they come from? And questioning them. So I think at best, if we're influenced by materialism, it will give us a kind of quite a limited perspective of the spiritual life, if it's possible to practice a spiritual life at all. It might just make us a bit less selfish. We might be aiming to be a bit less selfish, a bit more comfortable in this life, because then we die and the lights go out. So it kind of, it definitely rules out rebirth. So Buddhism has a doctrine, a teaching of rebirth, that our consciousness continues, our consciousness is not reliant on the body, that it continues after death, and that would completely rule that out if we're materialistic. So it kind of limits what your approach to Buddhism might be, actually. I'm just going to read a quote from Sangha Night. A couple of quotes. Mechanistic materialism suggests that everything is just dead matter. But it is surely much better to think that all things, trees, stones, streams, clouds, are alive, even if you personify them in a rather childish way. So it's better to see them as alive, even if it's in quite a childish way, than just as dead matter. And there's quite a strong quote which says, I would go so far as to say that a universe conceived of as dead cannot be a universe in which one stands any chance of attaining enlightenment. I'll read that again. I'd go so far as to say a universe conceived of as dead cannot be a universe in which one stands any chance of attaining enlightenment. Just one more example and then I'll move on, which is that if your mind is just your brain and limited to your brain, then meditation can only really affect you. So you're only really going to be meditating to affect you. Your mind might be affected by meditation, but it's not going to directly affect anybody else. So if you put someone in the metta bhavana, it's not going to have any impact on them. It's just, it might indirectly have an impact if you're a bit kinder to them or a bit nicer, but really your meditation will only affect you. And the idea that someone's mind might affect somebody else's mind would just seem ridiculous to a materialist. It's just kind of impossible. How could that happen? But it's not my experience, actually. I'll talk a bit more about that later, but my experience doesn't fit that. My experience is that our minds do seem to affect each other. I'm going to talk a bit more about that. So actually got quite depressed thinking about materialism. I've been thinking about it the last few days, and it's actually affected my outlook on things. The world just seems a bit kind of flatter and kind of deader, and I kind of think I'm really glad that I don't buy into that, and I feel quite sorry, for people, many millions and millions of people who do actually, because the world just seems a lot more depressing than it usually does, a lot more flat. So I'm going to move on to some more positive views on the world, some Buddhist perspective on the world. So according to Buddhism and the Buddha, materialism is wrong, it's flawed, it's faulty. And there is more than matter. It's not just that there's only matter, there is consciousness. And consciousness doesn't rely on matter. So in Buddhism, mind is primary, our consciousness, our awareness, our mind isn't our brain. It's something different to our brain, and it's primary, it's the driving force in our experience. So the first verses of the Dhammapada, so the Dhammapada is an ancient Buddhist text. It's considered to be one of the oldest collections of sayings. And the first verses of the Dhammapada say that all experiences are preceded by mind, they're led by mind and produced by mind. So it's quite a strong thing to say, all your experiences are led by your mind. They're preceded by your mind and they're produced by your mind. So the Buddha saw, and what Buddhism sees, is that your mind is the driving force, not matter, not your brain, but your consciousness, your mind. And it's actually, according to Buddhism, your consciousness, your awareness will dictate the kind of form that you take, the kind of physical form that you take, which can sound a bit weird in a materialistic world like ours, where we assume that our consciousness depends on our physical body. But actually, the kind of brain that you have, the kind of form you take, depends on the kind of awareness that you have. So according to Buddhism, we manifest as a form, depending on the kind of consciousness, the kind of awareness that we have. And I think it was Vedanya, I heard Vedanya, it might be wrong, Vedanya could correct me, but Vedanya was present at a talk Sangha Night was giving. He might have even been translating it, I believe, into Spanish. You can correct me if this is wrong, but anyway, Sangha Night was giving a talk about rebirth and consciousness and this particular idea. And apparently a lady came up to him at the end and said, "Well, do you mean to say that I could be reborn as a chicken?" And Sangha Night said, "Well, no, madam, only if you think like a chicken." So it's that was correct. Yeah, it was a talk that Vedanya had to translate into Spanish. And so I think it's quite a thing to say actually. If you produce the awareness of a chicken, then you'll become a chicken. You'll take the form of a chicken. That's how Buddhism sees things. Your consciousness leads your experience and produces the kind of form you take. And there's a school of Buddhism that takes this quite far actually. So it's a school of Buddhism called Yogacara. And what you could start off from saying is, well, everything you experience is an experience of your awareness. So right now, I'm experiencing you lot sitting watching me give a talk. And what I'm experiencing is kind of my eye consciousness is experiencing you visually, and my ear consciousness is experiencing the sounds. My smell consciousness might be experiencing some smells from time to time. So there's basically our sense consciousness is what we're experiencing. What we're experiencing is our awareness, our mind. We're not, all we can know in a way, all we can know is that we are conscious, that we are aware. All we're experiencing is sensations of consciousness, of awareness. And we can only deduce from that matter. Matter can only be deduced from that, it's kind of secondary. What we actually directly experience is our mind, our awareness, our senses, our consciousness. And that's very, very different to the modern scientific materialistic view of things. And there's a school, well, I could give a couple of examples of this. So right now, this could be a very vivid dream. I could just be having a really vivid dream that I'm giving a talk to you guys. And it would be exactly the same as the conscious kind of, the actual giving of the talk. Depending on how vivid the dream was, it could potentially be exactly the same conscious experience of giving the talk. What I'll be experiencing is my mind presenting, kind of eye consciousness images of you lot, and the rest of it. It could all just be a very, very vivid dream. And I hope it's not, because then tomorrow I've got to write the talk again and give the talk again. So hopefully this is really happening. But potentially, it could just be a really vivid dream. And we wouldn't know the difference. It'd be possible to know the difference, because that's the nature of our experience. It's awareness, it's mind that we experience. We inhabit our mind and our awareness. It's not the physical world that we are inhabiting. In some ways we are, but we experience it through our mind, through our awareness. And there's a school of Buddhism called the Yogacara that took it even further. It kind of went to the other extreme of materialism. And the Yogacara said that everything you experience is only awareness. There's only awareness, there's no matter, it's just awareness, it's just mind. There's no matter. And there's kind of logical arguments what you could follow that seem quite sensible actually, that you could follow that train of thought, but it's kind of the opposite extreme to materialism, which says that there's no mind, there's no consciousness, it's just matter. And the Yogacara, kind of 1500 years ago, argued the opposite. It's all mind, it's all awareness. And I think, but perhaps it's more true to say that, well, the experiences they're both the different sides of the same coin. We have a physical experience and we have our consciousness, our awareness, and they're both going on, and they influence each other. They kind of depend on each other, so they're not separate. It's not that there's just matter, and it's not that there's just consciousness. It's that we have an awareness, a consciousness, and that influences our physical experience. And we have a physical experience, and that can influence our consciousness, our awareness. They co-arise, they depend on each other. So maybe an example to try and illustrate that. So, well, there's a famous example of the grayling story that you'll all know. So, it can be demonstrated and experienced that in a sense what we inhabit is our state of mind. We don't inhabit the world around us, we live in our mental states. And the state of mind that we cultivate really influences the world that we experience. So in the famous grayling story that most of you will have heard, there's 3 people standing by the cleanest river in Sheffield, and 1 person standing by a sewer. And they're all in this exactly the same physical space, but it's their state of mind, their state of consciousness that determines the world that they inhabit. So we can see how our consciousness really does produce the world we inhabit. And we can all be, well, right now we're all in the same physical room, the same physical space, but having very, very different experiences, I imagine. And this got brought out in our previous theme in the Wheel of Life, where we could see that each realm was an expression of states of consciousness that we really do inhabit, very, very different realms, different worlds, depending on our states of mind. So our mind affects our physical experience affects our mind. It's not like the two, there's only one or the other, there's both, and they depend on each other, they influence each other. So it's a very different view of the world to materialism, which most people in our educated society would have and argue strongly for. So, the world is alive. According to Buddhism, the world is alive, and we are part of the world. We're not separate from the world. We are very much part of it. So this is part of the sense I got at places like Machu Picchu and on Easter Island and Tahiti, that I was part of a world. I wasn't kind of me and then this world out there that was for me to use and exploit. It's very much more like me and the world, me and the universe were the same thing. The world is alive, I'm part of the world. And it's also my experience that there are energies and forces in the world that are benevolent. This again might sound wacky if you're particularly materialistic, but it's my experiences that there are energies and forces in the world that are benevolent. And it felt like that was what part of my experience of those kind of very magical 2 weeks I had when I was in Tahiti and Easter Island. What that was, I was in relationship with a very benevolent and alive universe. And it's also true that what we know intuitively is that there are values. It's not, the materialistic view would say, well, there's no higher values, nothing. It can't be possible to have higher values. It's just kind of arbitrary values that humans create. But intuitively, we know that kindness is right, and we know that selfishness and stinginess is wrong. We know this intuitively. And so there are natural ethical laws. There are intrinsic natural ethical laws. They're not just man-made. They're not just invented. We know intuitively. There's, in a sense, I could create an evidence and argument for it, but it's something that just intuitively, I imagine most of us will know kindness is right and unkindness, selfishness is wrong. There are kind of ethical values inherent in the world. So, philosophy lessons finished. So we can move on from that and relax. The philosophy lessons finished, but what I want to explore is, well, how, as Buddhists, hopefully I've given evidence that materialism is potentially harmful to us as Buddhists and can limit our practices of Buddhism. But how do you go about experiencing the world of being more alive? How do you inhabit a world or universe and have a sense of it being more alive, a relationship with it which is more alive? What I would say is our minds are very powerful, our imagination, our minds are very powerful. In a way, we get the world that we want or that we tell ourselves. If we tell ourselves the world is a dead machine and there's nothing higher in it, well, that's the world we'll experience. We'll experience a world which is a dead machine with no higher values. Our minds are very susceptible to the stories that we tell them. So it's almost like we can brainwash ourselves with a story like that. The universe is dead. The universe is alive. With our minds, we can also imagine a world where the world is alive and inherently beautiful, ethical, and there are forces and energies that are benevolent. So with our imagination, we have a very powerful effect on how we experience the world. Just to give a story that illustrates it, there's apparently a scientific study. It may have been a materialistic scientific study, I don't know, but there was a group of athletes, and I told this story a few months ago, so people might have heard this, but apparently a group of athletes were tested, and some athletes were just trained as they usually would train for their particular sport, and another group of athletes were told not to do any training at all for a period of time, and the third group of athletes were told just to imagine that they were training for the same period of time, and the results were really surprising. There were quite strong results which showed that the athletes that just imagined that they were training were just as good outcomes, or sometimes better outcomes, than the athletes who actually did the physical training. So it illustrates the power of the mind and of consciousness and the imagination, versus the power of physically doing stuff. If we do something with confidence and trust, and that it's going to have an effect, it will have an effect. So, there's a Buddhist word, Shraddha. There's a Buddhist word, Shraddha, which means something like confidence or trust, or you could say faith in the teachings. And the opposite of that is cynicism. So if we've got a kind of cynical approach, well, this isn't real, this isn't going to work, this is just a dead machine. Well, what we'll get is a practice that doesn't really work, and an experience of the world that is a dead machine. But Shraddha is more intuitive. We can have an intuitive sense of what is actually true, what is actually real, what is actually valuable. There's something in us that intuitively responds to that. And we can cultivate that kind of more confident, trusting, receptive state of mind to the beauty and the truth in the universe and the aliveness of the universe. And Shraddha isn't a blind faith. It's not going back to a kind of dogmatic Christian faith that was rejected by materialism. Shraddha is based on reason and experience, but it's also based on intuition. It's tested by our actual experience. So if you meditate with confidence that it's going to transform your life and other people's lives, well, it will do. And if you meditate kind of thinking, well, this isn't going to have much effect, it won't have much effect. Your mind has a very powerful effect on what happens, the outcome. So that's the first thing to do, is to kind of have confidence that meditation does work, your practice does work, and it will affect the world, it will affect the universe. I think the second thing you can do to undermine materialism is to spend time in nature, spend time alone in nature. My experience of being at Machu Picchu in those kind of really vast mountains, those huge mountains, was to feel a sense of sacredness and humility. And that, I wasn't very big, I was quite a kind of very tiny part of the universe, and the universe was very, very mysterious and awesome. So you might have experienced this yourself in nature. You could just have a sense of mystery, that the world isn't to be known and controlled and understood. It's mysterious, it's beyond our understanding. And for me, if I go for a walk in the countryside, I start off thinking, well, where's the Starbucks? Where can I get a coffee? And it's kind of not very alive sense of the world. But after a few hours, if I'm exposed to, if I'm taken out of the concrete and out of the city, and I spend a few hours in nature, but by the end of it, or a weekend retreat by the end of it, it feels very much like I'm just part of the world, and the world is alive. That the grass, the trees, the birds, the insects we're just all part of the same thing. Actually, it feels very, very different. So I think if you spend time alone in nature, particularly on our Sangha retreats, which we spend in nature, you can just observe your relationship to the world changing, and your view of the world changing. Also, you can just notice and question any materialistic assumptions or stories. Just notice them and question them and test them. Well, where does this come from? Is this true? Is this true that this is a load of nonsense? Is it true that there's only matter? Where does that idea come from? If you notice that arising or undermining your practice, just notice it and question it, because that will weaken it, and that's that. Over time, you can weaken that story, that view. And counter to materialism, well, you could take Buddhas and Bodhisattvas seriously. If everything we experience is our mind and awareness, or a large part of it is our awareness, and we imagine a Buddha or Bodhisattva, well, how is that different from me experiencing you in my mind. If I'm experiencing a Buddha or Bodhisattva in my mind, how is that different? And if I bring to mind a good friend in the Metta Bhavana, and it feels like I'm in the presence of my good friend, that doesn't feel too weird. So why does it have to be weird to bring to mind and imagine a Buddha or a Bodhisattva to feel in the presence of them? In a sense, it's, just play with that in a way. Just take Buddhas and Bodhisattvas more seriously. You could try chanting mantras, see what effect it has. You could even pray to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. I'll say that quietly. You can even pray to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And in a way, don't worry about the metaphysics of it. They're not creator gods, they're not gods. But just take more seriously that there are benevolent forces in the universe and you can interact with them. Very good. Fifthly, notice the effects of meditation. My two look like a five there. Notice the effects of meditation. So, some things have happened in my meditation which don't fit into a materialistic worldview. So I'll just give two examples, one from me and one from Sangha. So I had an experience of the Metta Bhavana. I've had lots of them, but this is just quite a striking one, of where my consciousness seemed to affect somebody else's consciousness or seemed to be linked to somebody else's consciousness, which would just seem nonsense to a materialist. But definitely my experience. So I was sitting in here doing the Metta Bhavana, and I've been putting the same person in the Metta Bhavana for 2 years at that point, in the fourth stage. It was my ex-business partner. I'd left the business in quite a messy way and been quite badly treated, I felt. So I was quite upset by it, quite angry about it. And I put a lot of work into trying to resolve those emotions really in the Metta Bhavana. So for 2 years, I'd worked in the fourth stage with my ex-business partner. And then after 2 years, I was sitting in here doing the Metta Bhavana and I had this sense, actually it's about time I got in touch with my ex-business partner and just had a chat with him, just met up and had a chat with him. And then I went downstairs after the meditation finished, turned on my phone, and at that same time my business partner sent me a text message to say, it's about time we got in touch and about time we met up and had a chat. Which actually didn't really surprise me, because by then I'd had quite a lot of experiences of like that in a way, that my consciousness seems to be affected and affect other people's consciousness. So it didn't seem that weird actually, it just seemed quite normal. There's a story from Sangha when he just first started meditating. He was meditating in India when he was employed in the army as a signal worker in India. Let's find the right page. Yeah, so he was practicing meditation for the first times in his life. And he says, as I practiced, body consciousness faded away. My whole being was permeated by a great peaceful joy. And that says something in itself, actually, that you can have consciousness without any experience of the body. So so that would really freak a materialist out. Kind of, how can you have an experience of consciousness without body sense? But that's what happened. And then one night there appeared before me, as it were suspended in mid-air, the head of an old man. He had a grey stubble on scalp and chin, and his yellowish face was deeply lined and wrinkled, as though by the sins and vices of a lifetime. You're wasting your time, he exclaimed, with a dreadful sneer. There's nothing in the universe but matter. Nothing but matter. There is something higher than matter, I promptly retorted. I know it because I'm experiencing it now. Whereupon the apparition vanished. So, yeah, there's loads. If you read Sangha's memoirs, there's just loads. It's littered with kind of odd, non-materialistic experiences, really. It's just very fascinating to read. So, notice the effects of your meditation. And then also, notice glitches in the matrix. So, as I was supposed to say earlier, that as well as being like a dream, this could be the matrix, it could be a virtual reality, and we wouldn't know. So if the people in the film, the characters in the film of the Matrix, they experience awareness, they experience consciousness, and to them it's vividly real. But there are glitches sometimes in the Matrix where it doesn't quite work. So what I would say is look out for glitches in the Matrix. I'm not suggesting we're in a virtual reality, I'm just saying, using that metaphor, notice where something happens that doesn't fit in with the materialistic viewpoint. And just really really value those experiences. So it might be something in meditation, it might be something kind of clairvoyant or kind of more psychic in nature. Just note if you have any odd experiences, just notice them and value them because and pay attention to them. Okay, so I think that's enough. And I just want to end by saying that when I meditate, I don't sit down to meditate to change my neural pathways. That doesn't interest me at all. I sit down to meditate because I want to contact deep forces of wisdom and compassion that are alive in the universe. And I want to have an effect on the world and on other people's lives. So I think that's a much more, for me, motivating reason to meditate. It might change my neural pathways, that probably will happen, but the Buddhist view of the mind is much vaster, much more rich and vast than just that. So, where you don't know exactly what the consequences will be when you meditate, it's very, very mysterious. And we've got a choice about how you view the world. You can either view it as a dead machine to be exploited, or you could see it as a universe that's alive, a universe full of wonder. And a wonder full of wonder, mystery and beauty. So you've got a choice in how you view the world. And for me, I think the world is alive.